Canada's big banks are facing some criticism during this pandemic as they report their quarterly profits. The biggest bank, RBC, made a profit of $4 billion. The second biggest bank, TD, reported a profit of $3.7 billion. That may be good news to many as a sign that perhaps the worst of the pandemic's economic hit is over. But for the leader of the NDP, it's a sign that banks are earning money off the backs of struggling Canadians. And the profits are being reported as many of the banks raise their service charges. NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh is with me now. Mr. Singh, going to get to the banks in just a moment. It's good to see you again. But look, I want to start with this video obtained by Global News that shows you exiting a vehicle with someone who isn't a member of your household, and neither of you is wearing a mask, and you exchange a hug. That's a violation of the health orders. What happened? What do you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's one of those moments you get home and you kind of let your guard down. Lots of folks kind of get home and start to feel like, oh, you're comfortable at home. And I did that. I let my guard down and I apologize. We got to be vigilant, make sure that we're doing everything possible. And I kind of reverted back to pre-pandemic days. For me, for a friend, someone who had volunteered with me for the day, we went to a virtual event. I normally in pre-pandemic days would greet people or say bye to my friends with a hug. And I reverted back to pre-pandemic days, kind of forgot where I was, being home and being comfortable. And that's something that we got to be careful about. When you're at home in your driveway, you sometimes think, okay, I'm home now. You let your guard down, and I let my guard down, and I apologize for that.
Okay, let's move on. The banks are reporting their profits these days. They're very healthy. You say too healthy. What's your complaint?
Well, what to me seems just outrageous is that in the midst of a pandemic, when people have suffered and things have been tough, banks have made pretty significant profits. They've doubled and quadrupled their profit from last year, which means that they made profits in the pandemic off the backs of people. And on top of that, they are increasing banking fees at a time when we're in a pandemic. To increase banking fees in a pandemic when people were encouraged to use their bank cards and their credit cards more just seems like gouging. In a pandemic, to increase bank fees, I directly blame the Liberal government because they've got the power to stop this.
So what
significant powers?
What specifically? The Prime Minister was pressed again by reporters today about this, non-committal about taking any kind of action. What exactly do you want him to do?
Stop this. Don't let banks gouge Canadians in a pandemic. And it sounds a little bit absurd that I have to say that entire sentence, which would be self-evident. We wouldn't want anyone to be gouged in a pandemic. But banks that are completely within the federal jurisdiction, there's the Banks Act of Canada, there are memorandums of agreement, there's significant powers. We can literally limit the amount that banks charge on Canadians. And that's what the Prime Minister should be doing. One, declaring banks shouldn't be gouging Canadians in a pandemic. Again, it sounds outlandish that I have to say those words, but yes, they should make it clear. And secondly, use the powers we have at the federal government to limit the bank fees. Okay.
Look, the banks will point out that some of that profit they're reporting these days is from funds that were set aside for liabilities that didn't actually materialize in the pandemic. In fact, business and consumer insolvencies are lower than before the pandemic. That might suggest to some that most Canadians are managing to pay their bills. So what responsibility do the banks have if that's the case?
Well, they certainly shouldn't take an opportunity in a pandemic to raise fees. When people have suffered, we know certainly people have lost jobs. We know that people have had to use their bank cards more because we've been moving towards less cash transactions. So to take an opportunity when everyone knows that people are not using cash the same amount in a pandemic when we are all faced with challenges, people certainly have felt the pain of this. Small businesses have shut down. People have lost their jobs. So we know that there's been pain felt by people. For banks who are profitable, who took public money, made profits to increase their fees in a pandemic, it's just utter greed. And the fact that the Liberal government is allowing this to happen, despite the fact they have powers to protect Canadians, is also just making matters even worse.
Okay, let's move on. There's lots of debate right now about provincial reopening. Some are more aggressive than others. Some are moving very quickly. Some moving in more staged reopenings. And the federal government seems to be okay with that. To leave that to the provinces. Are you okay with that? Or are you happy the way you see provinces starting to move forward with trying to reopen here?
Reopening is obviously a very difficult question. We know that people are feeling really frustrated with the lockdowns and it's been tough on businesses. So we want to see a reopening that's following the evidence. It's following the public health guidelines. Each province is dealing with different scenarios. We know that right now, for example, there's a massive outbreak in Manitoba, which has meant that people are being sent to Ontario because the ICU units are being overrun. So the circumstances are very different province to province. So in that sense, the differences that exist are relative to how bad things are. I just hope that we are always maintaining the principle or the lens through which we make these decisions is the best advice for our public health officials.
Do you think there's a bigger role for the federal government here in sort of piloting these provincial reopenings, or should it be hands-off? I mean, we've heard them, public health agencies say, look, 75% of adults need to have had a first vaccination, 20% two vaccinations for us to safely start reopening. But some provinces are moving ahead of that, not waiting to see that happen. Are you okay with that?
I believe the federal government has a role to play in the vaccination process and in making sure that everyone gets vaccinated. And I've been really clear about that. I think the Liberal government has taken the approach that their job is just to get the doses and kind of hands off after that. I don't agree with that. I think the federal government has a role to make sure people get vaccinated, provide support, use all resources possible. And the second thing I think the federal government has a role to play is in the reopening, one of the most important tools is paid sick leave. We've heard from expert after expert that the highest rates of infection are still happening in places of work where people can't work from home. And so the federal program that we fought for is a good first step, but we've identified that there are problems with that program. And so that's why we're going to continue to say to Justin Trudeau, listen, the program was meant to work. It's not working. You know that. Fix that program. And that's a real concrete way the federal government can help in helping the reopenings in a concrete way.
Okay, let's finish on this. You also called again today. You continue to beat this drum about long-term care homes and where so many of the pandemic deaths have occurred, and calling on the federal government to eliminate for-profit long-term care homes in this country. Do you feel like you're making any progress on this? Because the government seems disinclined to take you up on it.
It's really troubling to me that the national shame of this pandemic has been the fact that seniors in long-term care homes bore the brunt of the pandemic. And it did not have to be this way. And one of the most telling and clear and obvious findings is that for-profit long-term care homes have been the worst site of conditions and the worst site of infection and death. So we're saying we need to start with Rivera, which is right now owned by a federal agency, completely owned. It's the second largest provider. So we're going to continue to put pressure. I don't believe that this pandemic attention towards long-term care should just stop because the pandemic has been dealt with. We have an opportunity to fix something where the most vulnerable people in our society continue to have the worst conditions of care. We can do something. And so far, the federal Liberal government has not really been really inclined to do anything. They've talked about national standards and seem to have abandoned that now. They're not really moving ahead with it. We are going to keep on fighting for the people that are often voiceless. These are seniors that often are dealing with multiple health issues and don't have a voice. We want to be their voice. We want to protect them. We want to make sure they get the care they deserve.
All right. NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh, good to catch up with you tonight. We'll talk again. Take care.
Thanks so much.